Stephanie, thank you so much. And as always, thanks to Malaprops for the ongoing partnership and hospitality, both as a partner with UNC Press, but also just partner within our own community. It's such a special bookstore. As Stephanie mentioned, I am here as a member of the UNC Press Advancement Council and wanted to say just a couple of words about the press. Last year, the UNC Press celebrated its first century of publishing award-winning books for the Academy and for the people of North Carolina, and indeed for this entire Southern region. UNC Press publishes books, about 125 books a year, which comes out to a new book every 3 or 4 days. Whether it's a scholarly monograph or a title intended for general audiences, each UNC Press title undergoes a rigorous peer review process, which in itself is a hallmark of university press publishing. So these are quality books. Well over half win awards each year, awards such as the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize in History, and the Bancroft Prize. Affiliated with our great public university system, the press serves the people of the state by publishing general interest books on North Carolina and the American South, books that explore the history and culture of our region. From its beginning, 101 years ago, the press has not shied away from difficult topics that challenge the status quo. Books about race, class, gender, social strife, among others. Tonight's book is one such title. It is groundbreaking, forward-thinking, provocative, informative, and stretches us to see beyond conventional horizons, all in the best tradition of the UNC Press. In my mind, no other institution does what the UNC Press does for North Carolina. Through its numerous awards and reviews, its amazing catalog of titles, and its sterling reputation, the name of the press is carried throughout our state, across this country, and indeed around the globe. I'm so excited to get us started. Stephanie, I'll turn things back over to you now to make the introductions for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kirk. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the folks we'll be hearing from this evening. I'm going to start with the conversation partner for tonight, Cookie Woolner. Cookie is a cultural historian of race, gender, and sexuality in the modern US, associate professor in the history department at the University of Memphis, and author of the forthcoming book, The Famous Lady Lovers, Black Women and Queer Desire Before Stonewall, that's out from UNC Press in September. And Cookie will be in conversation with our featured author this evening, Shonda Mims, PhD. And Dr. Mims is assistant professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University, but soon to be full tenured professor coming up in August. So we congratulate Dr. Mims on that. Dr. Mims uses several examples from Asheville to demonstrate the complexities of lesbian life and community within the urban South. The history of malaprops plays a role in these discussions. For those who've lived through this recent history, this book brings back memories and accounts for some of the social and political outcomes witnessed. So we welcome Dr. Mims discussing Drastic, Dykes, and Accidental Activists with Cookie Woolner. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, great to be here.
So I'm going to begin with a little snippet from my book that discusses Asheville, and then turn it over to Cookie to help me discuss the topics of the book that I want to focus on tonight. So in talking about a state pride festival in the 1990s, the event had been held in Asheville, North Carolina, and returned to Asheville in 1998. And it was met with angry picketing just 6 years earlier in Asheville. But now in 98, many citizens in Asheville increased the acceptance and welcoming environment for lesbian and gay people and queer people broadly. Attendees organized a visible and supportive response. In spite of some remaining opposition, community support for state pride was a result of the growth of a thriving gay-friendly business district in the city of Asheville, a large lesbian population there, and a heterosexual community of allies. Although a significant smaller city than Charlotte, who I focus on quite a bit in the book, Asheville, like Atlanta, the other city I focus on in Drastic Dykes, possessed the necessary attributes for lesbian and gay and queer visibility that Charlotte lacked. Nationally recognized as queer-friendly, occasionally referred to as the San Francisco of the South. By 2000, Asheville ranked increasing within the top 15 cities nationally for same-sex partnerships, and increasingly welcoming to lesbian and gay people in the 90s. The culture of the city's business climate proved that even in what some called the queer-hating state of North Carolina, a visible queer community could thrive. Asheville's large lesbian population supported its vibrant and eclectic downtown entertainment district, including the beatnik and lesbian hangout Malaprop's Bookstore. Catering to the broad and eclectic Asheville tourist market, Malaprop's attracted a diverse clientele willing to sustain the store in the long term. Like businesses in Atlanta's Peachtree district, Asheville's lesbian and gay business owners created an energized and revitalized downtown. And when Malaprop's opened in downtown Asheville in 1982, the district was all but abandoned. In fact, Charlotte's Creative Loafing newspaper observed that Asheville's independent businesses maintained original building structures, including the original Art Deco edifices, and the city itself exhibited, quote, all the idiosyncrasies of a truly metropolitan life, including homosexuality.
You're ending the piece there.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So before diving in there, I thought maybe we could just take a step back here to think about, the significance of your fabulous new book and the important intervention you're making in queer history. So would you agree that the field of queer history has been around for around 50 years or so, right? At this point, but for much of this time, the focus had been on northern cities, the experiences of men. And so it's really been more recently that we're seeing attention being paid to the queer South, so much so that you talk about in your book how, like, in the process of writing the book, like over the years, you've seen this emergence of more kind of institutions and resources around the queer South, right? So we're seeing kind of more interest in it, and we're finally starting to see more research and focus on it. And so your book is really one of the first to really kind of center on the experiences of queer women in the South, right? Especially in urban settings, when so much of our knowledge has been around New York and San Francisco. So you're really adding so much to the historiography through this really important intervention. So I just wanted to highlight that. And, given what you just said about Asheville and, the progressive nature of it and the queerness of it, I'd love to hear you talk about, of all the different places you could have focused on in North Carolina, right? Including not just Asheville, but also, Durham and other cities that have kind of been in the spotlight for kind of being queer havens. Why did you choose to focus on Charlotte, as well as, I think people probably can understand why the focus on Atlanta, but, why did you choose to focus on Charlotte?
So partly selfishly, because I was living there. I came out there. It's not my hometown, but I was living there and coming out as a lesbian, and history for me is personal. So that had something to do with it. But also at the time I had lived in Charlotte from the mid 1990s into the second decade of the 21st century, I witnessed this competition in Charlotte's city leaders' minds. Atlantans probably don't agree, but the newspapers and media show that there was this kind of competitive exchange between the two cities around who would take the position of leader of the New South. And Charlotte was doing everything it could throughout the late 20th century and into the 21st to try to gain that crown. And so I was intrigued with that, but also, like lesbians, Charlotte had been relatively ignored, other than Tom Hanchett's fine book on Charlotte's history. there really hadn't been an inclusion of Charlotte in the New South conversation, in the urban South historiography broadly. So that's what led me to put Charlotte in conversation. And finally, because it's Pride Month, the selfish personal part comes back, where I observed, because in grad school, you're observing everything analytically, right? And I'm on the way to Pride in Atlanta, and I'm just observing this kind of mass exodus from Charlotte to Atlanta for Pride at a time when Charlotte was struggling over and over throughout the 1980s, the 1990s, early 21st century to maintain a presence for Pride celebrations. And I really wanted to look at the two cities and see what was working in Atlanta and how did queer people organize differently in a city like Charlotte.
Yeah, you refer to the quiet tenacity of Charlotte, and I really like that wording. It also just makes me think about, like, how can we learn from, queer organizers in a city like that? What do we have to learn from the women in your book in this current moment? Maybe that's something to talk about more at the end of the conversation, but definitely something to kind of to think about here. So do you want to maybe go back to the beginning of the introduction to kind of talk about the genesis of the book and ideas around, especially around femininity in the South and Southern femininity, and how queerness is, can be stigmatized or not in the South. I love the introduction. You talk about both experiences your partner had and then you had, kind of growing up around issues of gender and sexuality in the South.
Sure. So first, I'll just say, because I've received some pushback, even as I've grown my social media presence on platforms like TikTok, thanks to my son, pushback against the word dyke. And I think as a historian, it's important for me to clarify that this is a particular choice to celebrate a group of women who called themselves dykes, the Drastic Dykes in Charlotte, North Carolina, who founded an organization, a separatist lesbian feminist organization in the 1970s. And I was really moved by their story as I found it in the archives and learned more about their lives. So this wasn't just me slapping on a name to try to be provocative. But I've learned as the books come out, the climate for using the word dyke in both ways meant to protect queer people, but also in ways to quiet conversations about queerness. That word has promoted a lot of conversation around my book. So I just want to give a shout out to the fierce Drastic Dykes of the 1970s in Charlotte, North Carolina, who claimed that title and claimed that organization and helped me write this book. And so the book started for me in many ways as in my master's thesis, but also in looking at my partner, which I detail in the beginning of the book, struggle with a family that ultimately rejected her because of what we determined was her hair length. It wasn't about her identifying as queer. It wasn't about supposedly her bringing me as a partner, a girlfriend to a family wedding. It was that in between the time they had seen her and we showed up at the wedding, she had cut her hair quite short. And this masculinity was a threat. And that's explicitly what her family said. And sadly, it caused her to lose all connection with her family. And for better, for worse, the opportunistic, naive grad student in me said on our way back to Charlotte from Augusta, Georgia, hey, this would make a great master's thesis. Very insensitive in hindsight, but at the time, my brain was turning around gender and sex and identity. And but also as a young girl, I really embraced my own femininity and had gone to these summer camps in the North to study classical music. And one of the things that was quite clear to me was that I presented in a hyper feminine way with makeup and teased hair and very, 1980s identity, but also that I represented for them the Civil War. I mean, they brought up that rhetoric, and I was the South. And I, at the time, I didn't really put all that together, of course, but as I went on to study history, I began to sort of contextualize that, especially as I came out as a lesbian and felt like And indeed, I did put away my makeup, put away my purses, and was so happy when I found out, oh, I can gain all these things back and still be the person I want to be and study the things I want to study. And all of that was a journey that aligned with my master's thesis in the early 2000s. So it is a very personal project of my own gender and sex journey and my spouse's gender and sex journey.
Oh, I love that. Where do I want to go from here? There's so many different places to go, but yeah, maybe since it's Pride Month, we should talk a little bit more about Pride specifically. One thing I thought was interesting in the book is you talk about how it seemed like, I'm not sure if this is a Southern thing or not, but it seemed like gay men were more kind of focused on putting on Pride events, being part of the organizations that put on Pride events. Did you find that Pride organizations and events were did they seem like relevant and important to Southern lesbians, or were they kind of focused on other types of organizing more?
So it's interesting. In Atlanta, lesbian feminists, and in Charlotte to a lesser degree, at least from the archival sources I looked at, lesbians were there on the front lines of the early radical organizing around Pride events. Charlotte doesn't really have that moment until the early 1980s. So the lesbian separatist moment has changed by the early 1980s. So for Charlotte, women's involvement in Pride doesn't have that lesbian feminist moment that we see in Atlanta, where lesbian feminists are on the ground floor of Pride organizing. And what's noticeable to me is that Pride in Atlanta holds the same space, the same month, June, and the same organizing sort of ideas that are consistent across the very first Pride recognition, which many scholars don't realize happens in 1970 in Atlanta. Lots of scholars date this to 1971, but Atlantans are gathering in the park, in Piedmont Park, which is where Pride is held for decades, to leaflet and talk about Christopher Street liberation, which is what Stonewall would have been referred to at the time. In Charlotte and Atlanta, as we move into the 1980s and 1990s, and that's also happening in the 70s, but especially as we move in Charlotte in the 1980s, we see women there organizing other events that they can attend. And this is also happening broadly in the Southeast. Women's music festivals, similar to the Michigan Women's Fest. There's a pretty important Southeastern Women's Music and Comedy Festival that's happening. Charlotte women are bringing queer and lesbian identified singers to events in Charlotte. There's this great story that one of the narrators in the book tells about organizing a lesbian singer event, and they're at a high school gym, and a preacher shows up with some folks to protest that event. And they are scurrying to gather newspapers and paper the windows so that these protesters and this preacher cannot see in, cannot interrupt their event. So these type of events matter equally, according to the women that I studied, as Pride events, because these are other ways of community. They are outside the bar. They meet women in a variety of circumstances, because women have ties to family in a way that men don't sometimes. And women's ties to family don't end with children. They continue to senior parents. They continue to extended family. Women are seen as the caretaker and the nurturer. So for women to give up sustained and consistent time to Pride events, which often were organized around bar communities, demands something different of them personally than it does for gay men.
Yeah. Was a city like Charlotte able to establish lesbian bars? Like, were those types of spaces welcome there, or were they longstanding there? Were they successful?
So they were successful. They were not longstanding, but again, I found a consistency of space. So that though the names may change, the ownership might change, the spaces were often queered. And so I could map a queer geography in Charlotte and spaces and places. And oftentimes those spaces were maintained or sustained by gay men.
Mhm.
But certainly lesbians used those spaces for community and gathering, like Olean's Bar, which was a drag show bar for years in Charlotte. Sadly, last time I was there, it was a Dunkin' Donuts. I'm not sure what it is now, but the stories of Olean's from lesbians that I interviewed are fantastic, and talking about the ways that in Charlotte, 20 years after Stonewall, Olean's was still sort of approached through a backdoor entrance, a quiet sort of, it felt very 1950s almost, in the
Mhm.
way lesbians and queer people would access that bar. But then also really fun and kind of freaky stories about, dust ups among women, and women who were concerned about other women who might be, hitting on their girlfriend. And my favorite quote comes from one of my narrators, who says, usually all it took was a high heel popped at someone's head from a drag queen and the fight was over and they went back to the show. But these spaces were often shared. But by the late 1990s, early 2000s, Hardigan's Pub shows up in Charlotte. And it's a really important bar because it gets national attention when the Democratic National Convention comes to Charlotte in the 21st century, because Hardigan's Pub is right by Panther Stadium, the NFL team. It's right downtown. So it gets a weird mix of like straight revelers on game day. And the Democratic National Convention there in the city, with a lot of dust up around same-sex marriage fights in North Carolina at the time, meant that Hardigan's got some national press for their well-known and much-loved pudding wrestling that took place on the weekends. But then again, they also made their money by hosting predominantly straight, white audiences of men coming in for the football game, and they were able to charge a lot for parking in those tailgate spots at the bar. So that's what it looked like on the ground in Charlotte. But Charlotte spaces like that always felt a little more hard fought and often shared in ways that weren't always the case in Atlanta.
Mhm. Yeah. So, of course, when we talk about Southern spaces, it's important to talk about issues of race and segregation, right? There might be this idea, or this optimistic hope coming probably from white women like me that sexuality and desire might have been spaces that people could kind of organize across race. But what did you find? You had a great quote that I mentioned earlier.
Lesbian is not a unifier.
Yes. Yes. I forget which part of the book you write about that in.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It
Talk
might
about
be in
that.
the introduction, but it is true that I tried and I wanted very much for this to be a book more about women of color and white women and queer identity in one big sort of discussion. But repeatedly, I found that just like white women and women of color, and white women and Black women in particular, which is how I thought about race mostly in this book, did not share space in the US South, because at the end of the day, white women, even if they were masculine identified, could move through the world with a layer of privilege that Black women would never have. And so separating themselves from a Black community, whether it be church or house parties or family, those spaces and places were quite important. Indeed, the geographer Latoya Eves did a really important piece looking at Asheville and race among lesbians, Black women and white women. And what Eves has found, and my research supports, is that in a predominantly white city like Asheville, Black women don't find it to be the lesbian mecca that I described for white women. They don't have that same experience that I had as a younger person coming out and going to Asheville. And I remember walking into Malaprop's, and I wasn't quite out to myself yet, but I knew very much that that was a space I needed to figure out how to foster in my own life. There were vegetarian restaurants downtown. And of course, lesbian equals vegetarian, or it did in my very young queer questioning mind. And so it just all felt very free and accepting to me in a way that my whiteness afforded, right? And so I had to think about that as a researcher, and therefore the book disproportionately discusses white women. And I thought it was particularly important for me with a name like LaShonda that people often assume might be read as a or understood as a Black woman's name, that I write quite clearly about my position in writing this book and what it meant to be a white woman doing this work, and what the limits and constraints are from doing good oral history work as a white person, not just with the privilege of whiteness, but with the privilege of the academy, with the privilege of class. It's hard, so that some of my oral histories were done in bars, but those bars were frequented, like Hardigan's, predominantly by white women. And so it is true that one of the Black women that I interviewed for this book was quite clear that she sought out white spaces as a way to put herself in a different sort of socioeconomic queer community, but that it would never be her community.
Mhm.
And I learned a lot from that and thought about that repeatedly. So the other thing I just want to say is that I also did not want to go and pull a set of stories of Black or Latinx or Latina women, a group of women of color, and then just make that a chapter in the book. That didn't feel like the right thing to do either. So I struggled a lot, and I'm willing to say that there are places and spaces where I look forward to other scholars coming in and picking up the ball and strengthening this work, because we need more histories of women, period. And I think the story changes when we take a queer lens. But I think it's really important that we prioritize coming at that angle from different racial spaces and places, especially in a community as charged as the US South.
Yeah. I mean, with Charlotte being a smaller city, was there more possibility there for mixed spaces? Maybe because just because there weren't as many places to go or as many opportunities, as opposed to like Atlanta at all, do you think?
So it's interesting. Charlotte, because they were so desperate to be big and fancy, annexed a ton of land. And so in population size, they actually are bigger than Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
But that's just about how Charlotte, again, needed itself to be seen as bigger by like bringing in the suburbs. And Charlotte, especially in the 21st century, has, at least the data supports that it's been quite good for Black people in terms of jobs and socioeconomic growth and housing. But it is true that if you look back, especially in the 1970s, which is really when I was able to start queer histories in Charlotte. I was able to go back earlier in Atlanta, but Charlotte, I wasn't really able to get queer women's stories until the 1970s. And there are a few threads of Black women there, and there are a few in Atlanta, and they are indeed sharing space with white women. Or one of the most intriguing stories that I came up with in regard to race, which dealt with Atlanta, was white queer women using Black women's spaces as a place to feel safe, where other white people that they knew, friends and family, et cetera, would not see them. And they could go into these queer friendly spaces that were predominantly Black populations and feel, according to the white women narrators, welcomed, and they were so excited to see us, but clearly that is white women appropriating those spaces as a place to be anonymous. But it's a good
reminds me of like straight girls going to gay bars so that they don't have to like deal with getting hit on type of, are they necessarily welcome there even though they feel more comfortable there?
Exactly. And Nashville has one of our last, I live in Nashville, and we have one of the last, although there are new ones opening now. So rumors of the demise of the lesbian bar are, questionable. There are new ones, really important ones opening up in California, but we have an active historically lesbian bar here in Nashville. But I was there just a couple of weeks ago, and it wasn't bachelorette parties that were there. It was bachelor parties that were there. What seemed to be and presented as straight men coming from out of state to celebrate their bachelor parties in this queer, predominantly trans and not even necessarily lesbian identified anymore, but a queer identified bar. So yeah, I thought that was pretty fascinating.
That's
And
a whole other dissertation project right there for someone.
exactly, we need a grad student to show up at that bar and be questioning like I was as a younger person.
My goodness. Well, maybe unfortunately, we should talk about something like, the Christian right, who of course were playing a presence in queer spaces and just pushing back against queer visibility in the 80s and 90s. I liked how you kind of mark the 1993 March on Washington as kind of like a moment leading to more national queer visibility, which then leads to more pushback. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, do you think we should talk about, is it just kind of, I mean, do you feel like history is kind of repeating itself in this current moment? Do you see a lot of similarities between, the kind of Jesse Helms era of the 80s and 90s than in our current moment?
I don't know that I have a good or simple answer to that. I want to believe that we are in a better and stronger place. I'm encouraged by the Arkansas ruling yesterday for trans youth and gender affirming care. I'm encouraged by the students that I teach. But we all know that it was white students who shut down civil rights temporarily in the US South in the 1950s. So the youth aren't always the ones who will carry us through. So I don't want to be too starry-eyed about that. What I did notice in my opening reading tonight, I talk about the 1990s and these state pride. So North Carolina has, I think they still do, a statewide pride celebration. And after a while, it became just centered in the Research Triangle. But in the 1990s, it was moving around to different cities. And one of the cities it wanted to move to, and Charlotteans applied for it to come to, was Charlotte. And like I said in my opening, in Asheville, there were pictures of protesters at the first time it was in Asheville, and then it comes back to Asheville and it seems a little bit better. And I attribute this again to a funky downtown tourist district that Charlotte did not and could not support. There were bookstores similar to Malaprop's that did not survive. In Charlotte, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that, but one lesbian that I talk about in the book who owned a lesbian bookstore in Charlotte said in Pinstripe Charlotte, queer people are also respectable and they're cautious, and she felt like they were not willing to risk coming into her bookstore that was explicitly not even queer, but just explicitly independent and alternative. And so those kind of stores didn't last in Charlotte, and those kind of communities didn't last. They were bulldozed, and they didn't, like I talk about Asheville maintaining sort of a look in their downtown that Charlotte was happy to mow down, it seems, and not support that historical moment. But when state pride came to Charlotte, the team that organized it outside of Charlotte said, we're choosing Charlotte because we know there's going to be pushback. We want to respond to that pushback. And it was happening in the shadow of the National March. And so this is very much like what's been happening here in Tennessee, where churches saw video clips from the National March and took those video clips to the churches and started campaigns against state pride, just like people in Tennessee and other states took here where I teach in Murfreesboro, leaders here just last year took video from the Murfreesboro Pride and said, we're going to shut it down because this is immoral. The same thing was happening in the 1990s. In Charlotte. And the great thing was Charlotte's organizers of that parade won the fight, and they won it in the media too, because the church, one of the ways the church pushed back was, we don't want a parade going by our Baptist church on a Sunday afternoon. and our parishioners will be getting out, and that'll be not okay. And so Charlotte organizers beat them to the punch, and they said, we'll move the time. Is there anything else we can do? And all of a sudden, the Charlotte Observer was full of political cartoons and letters to the editors saying, now who are the Christians in this conversation? Who's behaving thoughtfully toward their neighbor? And so that parade happened, but it would be 20 years before another queer pride parade would happen in Charlotte. In fact, it would be corporate sponsorship that would open space for pride in Charlotte, because there was so much community pushback led by the Christian right, that they could no longer hold a pride in a public park, and they moved to a private space sponsored by Bank of America. So one of the things I like to point out is that while lots of queer people and anti-capitalists cringe at the corporatization of pride, in the cities of Atlanta and Charlotte, it's mattered to have that corporate buy-in to, and in Charlotte, to literally allow space for queer gathering.
I mean, do you think that is something that we're about to lose in this current moment, right? Thinking about, what's been going on at Target and their the pushback they've gotten about their pride displays. So they're moving them. We're seeing less like rainbow corporate pride than usual this year. Does it seem like we're already kind of in a moment of losing some of that corporate support?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated to see how this plays out, because I've seen it in my own stores here at Tennessee and my own Target, and I was in there 1 week and it was rainbow corporate bonanza, and I was in 2 weeks later and it was like it never happened. And lots of the workers that were at Target were wearing pride affirming t-shirts or name tags, but it caused me to think a lot about this historical moment, and would corporations now, as they seem to be doing, sort of back up from this buy-in, and what might that mean to pride? Again, my colleagues in history of capitalism will have interesting analyses to offer, but I think it's worth considering in places like the US South, how important those major corporations can sometimes be, even if their heart isn't in the right place.
Yeah. All right, I do have one more question, and then I'm hopefully there's plenty of other questions waiting from folks. But I'm just curious, what's your response right now to somebody from like New York or Portland or San Francisco being like, everyone should, if you're queer and trans in the South, you should just move, you should get out right now. Like, how do you what's your response to people who talk like that? Because we're hearing like a lot of that discourse, or like boycotting Southern economies.
That's been really personal for me. I am just finishing up a term on the Committee of Lesbian and Gay and Trans History for the American Historical Association. And there was some talk about my colleagues in the West Coast, oh, well, we can't bring our conferences to Tennessee. I both understand that, but I also see how it shuts down support for folks like you and me, Cookie, and the fact that we know we could name 10 scholars and colleagues right off the bat here in Tennessee who are explicitly queer and doing explicitly queer scholarship, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's that component, but there's also our students who, for a variety of reasons, and this gets back to the question of race and community and poverty, for a variety of reasons, people don't want any more than someone from Portland might not want to pick up and move. One of my narrators, who I met in a queer bar in Hardigan's in the bathroom, one of my favorite, how do you find a good oral history? Well, you find it in the toilets, folks. I met her in the bathroom. We did our oral history in her motorhome at the NASCAR track in Charlotte. It just doesn't get more Charlotte than that. But she was also a debutante, had great stories. And she said to me one time when I was, again, a young grad student, really wanting her to talk about her gender identity and this and that. And she said, look, at the end of the day, I'm a Southerner. Like, that's my identity. And so I think people need to remember that this region means something to people. And particular communities, for a variety of reasons, have ties here, and my students have ties here, and they're vulnerable, and they come into my classroom vulnerable. And I think we need to stay and be loud, and there is a huge support for that loudness. We just won the drag battle here in Tennessee. And I believe we're going to see those wins. You asked, do I think we're repeating? I'm confident that we are going to continue to see some dips, but I think we're also going to see some wins, because there is too much, for lack of a better way to put it, water under the bridge for queer acceptance and queer welcoming among generations that are coming up.
Yeah, very well put. Thank you.
Question.
Hello. Yes, we do have questions. Just had to remember to unmute myself there. It's not like I've been doing this for 3 years, right? What a great conversation. Thank you. And we do have some questions, so we'll get right to it. So the first one is from Karen Cox, and I'll go ahead and give a shout out to Dr. Cox, who is a professor at UNC Charlotte, and wrote a book that we also had the pleasure of hosting an event for, called No Common Ground, among other books. So hi, Dr. Cox. And her question is, what do you think makes the experience of queer women in Southern urban spaces unique from the women in non-Southern urban spaces?
So thanks, Dr. Cox. I'm glad you're here, a long supporter and cheerleader for my career, and I always appreciate her support. So I do think that, first of all, just thinking about the South as urban matters, because the default is to think of the South as Appalachia, or as rural, as impoverished. And the South is wealthy, it's corporate. And I think what women in urban spaces in the South celebrate is what lots of people in urban spaces celebrate, which is corporate or economic success in an urban, growing environment. They have these opportunities to grow their careers that are international. So there's that, and that brings people to those cities. So that was a huge thing in Charlotte when Bank of America merged and came from California and merged with a bank in North Carolina. It changed the landscape for queer people there. And it meant that a whole lot of corporate-minded folks and pro-queer folks wanted to build their lives in a place that would be welcoming, and they changed the landscape in places like Charlotte. But in both Atlanta and Charlotte, there is also a university community. Charlotte's a little different than Atlanta. Atlanta's funky, supportive queer neighborhood tends to build up around Piedmont Park, and lots of the main universities in Atlanta are quite close to Piedmont Park. The difference in Charlotte until recently was that UNC Charlotte was kind of on the edge of Charlotte proper. And so UNC Charlotte was actually one of the first hosts and supporters of Pride in Charlotte, but queer organizers were trying to figure out, how do we get people from the university back into town for the bar parties? And so I think what queer women did was they maintained spaces where they could build their careers and stretch the borders of an urban community. And one of the longest running queer organizations in Charlotte was the Charlotte Business Guild, is the Charlotte Business Guild, a queer business-minded community, so that the urban meant sometimes that respectability led over queer visibility, for example, pride parades, et-cetera. And that's one of the things that I noticed as different in then thinking about folks in rural spaces. And I would also say, even though religion matters a lot in Charlotte and Atlanta, there's still space and ways to build your lives outside of a church community. In an urban southern city like Charlotte or Atlanta, that isn't quite as easy for Southerners, especially non-white Southerners in rural spaces.
And what can you what can you say about contrasting the the urban spaces in the South and outside of the South? Of course, your research is focused, on the spaces in the South, but.
Yeah, so I think what makes the urban South different, and again, I'm going to return to respectability politics, and that organizing often meant playing nice, whether it was with churches, whether it was with corporations, in a way that didn't always matter to Northern or West Coast counterparts. And that in the South, there was, or there is often, there's a good many transient folks in Southern communities, urban spaces, but there's also community ties to families, and that from folks that might move into those Southern urban behemoths, but still have ties throughout the state. And that's not always the case when you're looking at Western cities, West Coast cities, or New York, New England area. That tends to be a place where people might leave their families and go to an entirely different space, not always. But also I would say that, again, in the urban South, people love it or leave it, grapple with Southernness. Even if they come there like Dr. Woolner, not a Southerner, and they're like, oh, I live in the South now. But you are confronted with Southernness. And so that becomes a part. I don't know. I've never lived in Portland. I've never lived in New York City. But my sense from the research is that regional notion of Southern identity just permeates the landscape here. And that's certainly what I hear from my narrators.
Dr. Woolner, would you like to weigh in on that as a transplant to the South?
Well, yeah, the first time I taught a queer history class, we did a week on queer Southern identity. And yeah, I asked my students, I was like, if I spend the rest of my life here, will I be a Southerner? And I was told, definitely not. If you're not from the South, you will never be a Southerner, right? So yeah, so as a Northerner, I've definitely kind of, yeah, I do feel that sense of kind of outsideness as a non-Southerner who's quite happy to be here and happy to play queer Southerner.
Okay, so we're going to go now to a question from Mary Mack. Pardon me, scroll for just a second. Since we're on the topic of Southernness, how do you think your quote unquote Southernness impacted your ability to interact as an oral historian?
Oh, this is such a great question. So I think it's everything, just like I think whiteness or other racial or ethnic identity is everything. E. Patrick Johnson, the great oral historian of Black queer communities.
Yeah, Sweet Tea.
Yes, right. Sweet Tea and Honey Pot, and was kind enough to talk to me about this very issue and what he felt was his outsider status, and in a variety of ways. But there's the layer of being in the university community, that ivory tower sort of layer. So that's an issue. But I think for me, and honestly, the academic job market is famous for being difficult, but this is one of the things I was able to kind of sell when I was looking for my job was I am a Southerner. My family is from the South. All of my family is from Alabama. I know what it is to come out as a queer person in the South. I live in these spaces and places. I teach these students. And so I think it mattered in going into the discussions with my narrators. Some of them weren't from the South originally, but those that were, I understood the things they were talking about. I knew the church hymns that came up. I knew the landscape discussions that they had. I spent a lot of time in Atlanta as well. I'm educated in Georgia primarily. So my education took place in Charlotte or in Atlanta and Athens. So I know those spaces and I know the local. So one of the issues with oral histories, right, is knowing the local space and the local landscape. And I knew those things and that helped, but I also know sort of how to go in and do an oral history and eat a tomato sandwich with someone. I know what that means and the importance of those moments. And I think it is a privilege to have that regional understanding of what Cookie talked about right at the beginning, which is what does it mean to wear high heels to the bowling alley as a kid, which I remember famously doing, like what does it mean to be very Southern feminine identified and the Southern woman? That helped me, I think, in a lot of ways.
Thank you. And we're actually going to go back to Dr. Cox, who says, can you talk about the use of the term queer women in your title versus the term lesbian?
Yeah, sure. Boy, howdy. I still look up.
Boy, howdy. Love that.
Cassie. And I promise I didn't plan that. That's who I am.
Yeah.
I still have to look up the subtitle of my book. I am not because UNC Press, we went back and forth like, how are we going to do this? And I worked on this project really for 20 years.
You thought using Dykes was a challenge, like the rest of it was like the real.
That's the funny part. UNC Press never batted an eye at Drastic Dykes. It was like, really, I wanted to use New South. And so they were, someone said, oh, that's so UNC Press, that they're like, you need to think about New South. But queer versus lesbian. And I was in a moment where some of those conversations were changing, but also where my narrators valued lesbian deeply. And so in many ways, though it didn't feel like it at the time, I now kind of see it as a good, I won't even call it compromise, but a good title that shows who women were when they needed to claim dyke or lesbian in the main title, but that queer women, better identified women who are in my first chapter, who are all World War II era women into the 1950s and 1960s. I couldn't get at that history in Charlotte, but I could in Atlanta. And I open with one of the more famous queer women of the South, Carson McCullers, because I was able to look at some of her letters and her papers at Emory and really think about how she was grappling with her own sexuality. And that was, to me, clearly queer grappling in a way that, would she claim that title? Probably not. I don't know. But I also needed to think about my students and students coming after and speak to students who could look at that book and see themselves in it. The students of my son's cohort that very much embrace the idea and the identity of queerness. I needed them to see themselves in history, and that felt important in that title.
Yeah. And Cookie, I know that this is, and I know that you're here to support LaShonda, and we thank you, but we're getting to the top of the hour. And I do, LaShonda, if you don't mind.
I wanted Cookie to start with this. And then I
Cookie,
read, yes.
Yeah. Cookie, I want to invite you to tell us a little bit about your book that's coming out in September to give people a little tease before we end this evening.
Yes, very much so. So my book is about many women who were Southern migrants, many of whom went to the North in the Great Migration. So it's focused on mostly in Chicago and New York in the 1920s and 30s. And it started out as mostly being about some of the more well-known blues singers who I knew were queer, such as Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Ethel Waters. So there's a whole chapter on the kind of importance of the entertainment industry for Black queer women, kind of as a place to work, a really important place to work outside of domestic work, which is really often their only other, work opportunity in the Jim Crow era. And also a great place for women to meet other women. But then in the archives, I found all these other amazing kind of more everyday anonymous women who are often kind of hard to find their backstories in the archives and census reports, but who I would come across in newspaper articles. A lot of stories about violence between women and kind of jazz age prohibition kind of speakeasy events, which I kind of talk about how these are kind of these negative newspaper representations that are actually kind of introducing the concept of lesbianism to the public and to Black readers of the Black press in the 1920s. So it's kind of starting with kind of this this tension over kind of this notion of there's a new sex problem, kind of like the emergence of the lesbian as kind of like an inherently violent figure in the North, but then kind of balanced by this kind of increasing visibility of kind of queer subcultures and like places where people can experience, queer Black joy and, dancing together in a speakeasy, in kind of literary salons, watching blues performers. So that's kind of the world I'm capturing, or I've tried to capture in the 20s and 30s, and it will be coming to UNC Press September 12th.
Yeah,
Yay.
we're looking forward to that. And another great title, The Famous Lady Lovers. Yeah.
So yeah, lady lovers and women lovers were often terms that were used. Even though you started to hear the word lesbian in the 20s, but it doesn't seem like many women really actively, use that term until we get a little into the more of the post-World War II era.
Yeah. Well, so it's the top of the hour, and thank you both. Thanks to everyone who's joined us this evening and asked questions. Thanks for the conversation and the thoughtfulness of the conversation and the answers to the questions. Really appreciate it. So I just want to give you an opportunity for any final thoughts before we say goodnight this evening. And Cookie, we'll start with you and then give LaShonda the last word.
All right. Well, I've been honored to be in conversation with LaShonda. We've been, queer historian friends for a decade or so, and it's always so lovely to get to talk. And again, I just think your book is a really important intervention. We have so little history of queer women in the South, and so you've created such I can't even say that anymore because now we have your history. So thank you for bringing us this very, very much needed history.
Yeah, I would just say thank you to Malaprops. Again, it was a space where I deeply felt that I belonged, and that for a young person was not a place that existed for me very often. So I just feel thrilled to be here talking about a project that I've been thinking about for so long. And also to remind people that the South is, US history, and that queer women's history is women's history, which has so often been sidelined from the sort of traditional historical narratives. And that's what I really want to push for. And I look forward to the people that will come after me and push harder and further than I've been able to welcome a variety of women to women's history in the US South. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And make sure to pass that along to our founder, Emeka, because that was certainly such a huge part of what she was doing when she opened the store in 1982.
I quote her in the book, so I would love
Yeah.
for her to know that directly from me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. And thanks again to everyone who's been with us this evening. Thank you for your support. We encourage you to buy Dr. Mims' book, or Malaprops, or another indie if you can. And if you can't, support your local libraries. We're down with that too. And they need support, and they are also doing amazing work in communities. So just a shout out to libraries. And to Cookie, Dr. Woolner, please keep an eye out for The Famous Lady Lovers, which you can actually pre-order as well. Go ahead and do that commerce business. Also available for pre-order now from your local independent bookstore. So thank you both again for being with us this evening, and to everyone, please stay safe and well. We look forward to seeing you again sometime soon in the store or on the internet. Thanks so much. Good night.